For the fourth time in a row, the SNP has won the election here in Scotland. They didn't, however, gain enough seats to rule as a majority government by themselves. An important detail in the ongoing argument over the second independence referendum. My final guest is the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon. Nicola Sturgeon, welcome. I don't know if you were able to hear Michael Gove talking a little moment ago, but it seemed to me that he was saying that they would not be challenging you in the Supreme Court when things came down to it.
Well, that's what I heard him say, but you know, I think it would be absurd and completely outrageous if it ever got to that point, if it ever got anywhere close to that point. Because remember, for this to end up in court, which is not something I ever want to see, it would mean that a Conservative government had refused to respect the democratic wishes of the Scottish people and the outcome of a democratic election, and tried to go to the Supreme Court to overturn Scottish democracy. I think it is an understatement to say that that wouldn't play well, but it would also
do you think perhaps that the British government has heard your argument and rather agreed with it?
I hope so, because it's not really, or it shouldn't be in a democracy, a controversial argument. Michael Gove opposes independence. He's entirely entitled to that view. I support Scottish independence. I'm entitled to that view, but it shouldn't be up to him or I to decide that question. It's up to the Scottish people to decide that question. And in this election, they have voted overwhelmingly for the SNP. And we stood on a manifesto commitment to, firstly, and this is where I actually agree with much of what Michael Gove was saying, firstly, to continue to steer the country through the COVID pandemic. I'll be back behind my desk in Butte House this afternoon taking those decisions. But after the crisis, to give the people of Scotland the opportunity to choose our own future in a referendum. And the fact that we're sitting here having a debate about whether or not that outcome is going to be respected says a lot about the lack of respect for Scottish democracy that this UK government has demonstrated over quite some time now.
Of course, we can't be sure what will happen at the court level after the legislation goes through.
Let's hope it doesn't get there.
And it might not be it might not be the British government, it might be somebody else takes you to court. Can I ask you straightforwardly, have you taken legal advice about whether you could win such a court case?
I haven't been planning for a referendum over this past year. I've been focusing on COVID, but anybody who knows anything about the legislative process in the Scottish Parliament knows that any government has to consult its law officers before it brings forward legislation. So that will all be part and parcel of what we do, but so, you know, I don't want to lose this point, Andrew. So no, we haven't got to the stage of introducing a bill formally, but that will be part and parcel of the process. But can I just be clear, because I think it's important we don't lose sight of this point, that all of this talk about legality and whether or not the UK government would challenge the Scottish government in court misses a point. The people of Scotland have voted for the SNP on the strength of offering, when the time is right, an independence referendum. Sure. And as in 2011 leading up to 2014, any UK government that has any respect for Scottish democracy would simply accept that and come to an agreement with the Scottish government that put it beyond any legal doubt.
It misses one point, but it may home in on another point, because all the way through the referendum, the election campaign, you said that you would not support, you would not oversee an illegal referendum, which means that you would have to win such a court case. Now, the Scotland Act 1998, which is the relevant thing, it's on the screen here, is very, very clear. It says right at the top, the following aspects of the Constitution are reserved matters, that is, B, the union of the kingdoms of Scotland and England. That seems in black and white pretty clear. Do you think you could possibly overturn that?
I think you'll find, if you had a range of lawyers in here, I'm sure you would find a range of views on that, and I accept that if it comes to being decided in the courts, then that will be the debate we have to have. Of course, for the union to be dissolved, that would require legislation. The referendum is the way in which you determine whether there is majority support in Scotland for that. So yes, I don't sit here and argue that there is not a debate about that. But the point here, and it is an important point not to simply skip over, in the previous referendum in the run-up to 2014, what happened was that the UK government agreed that there was a mandate for a referendum, and we agreed jointly to put that beyond legal doubt. That is what should happen this time, when the Scottish Parliament decides the time is right for a referendum, which is not right now, but after the crisis.
Because you have said you would not have an illegal referendum.
Indeed.
If you don't win that case, then it's game over, isn't it?
Well, look, again, this whole debate is predicated on a situation where a UK government refuses to accept Scottish democracy. And what that means is that you have a UK government that is saying that the UK is no longer a union based on consent, that it is no longer a voluntary union, that somehow Scotland is to be retained within that union by force of law. Now, if that is the argument, then we are going onto unprecedented territory. And Michael Gove was at pains to say that Scotland, of course, did have the democratic right, if it chose so, to become independent. So
I'm not denying in any sense the force of that argument. I'm just saying this is where you might end up. And I'd just like to quote you Judge David Hope, who's former Deputy President of the Supreme Court, and he says they, meaning the SNP, are trapped within a statute which is very carefully drafted.
Look, if the argument, and I'm not talking about David Hope here, of course, for whom I've got a lot of respect, and he's not a politician, but if the argument of the unionist side is that Scotland is trapped, then it strikes me that that is one of the strongest arguments for independence. Now, as it happens, and time will tell, Andrew, I accept that, I don't think we'll get anywhere near this. And I think if you listened, as you clearly did because you were asking them the questions, to Michael Gove's answers, they know, the UK government knows, that if we ever get into a situation where this has been determined in the courts, and actually what the UK government is arguing is that there is no democratic route for Scotland to independence, then they're in a very, very bad place. I don't think we will get to that point.
I can hear that you don't want this to happen, and at some level you don't believe it ever will happen.
I don't believe it will.
But it could happen.
Sure.
And if it did happen, you would then be at the end of the road.
Well, look, if we get to that point, then Scotland will be in a situation where it is being told that it has no democratic route to become an independent country. Now, you don't have to. Well, you know, the implications of that would be very grave indeed, and I don't think we will get there because actually.
So, what do you think would happen if that happened?
I don't think we will get there, and because I do believe that at a fundamental level, even this Conservative government knows. But look, that would be a very serious situation. I can't sit here and answer that right now because it would be such a grave and serious and undemocratic situation that I don't believe on either side anybody wants it to get to that point. There is a fundamental issue of democracy at play here. We have just won a landslide. I could sit here, but I'm not going to because I know you know them, take you through all of the record-breaking statistics of this election. I'm sure I'll do that many times today, whether people want me to or not. But we just won a landslide election. Now, don't get me wrong here, I am not, and this is where there is perhaps an exaggeration of the difference. I'm not proposing a referendum in this instant right now.
In a second.
And get on to
but nonetheless, a lot of those people who voted for you and the SNP, or indeed for the Scottish Greens, did so on the basis that you were promising them another independence referendum. And there are various routes through to that, but I'm just pointing out that one of the most important routes through to that has a huge blockage, and you don't know, and you can't tell me what would happen if that.
Indeed, but you're sitting here legitimately, and this is not any attempt at a criticism of you or the line of questioning. But all of that is predicated. I'm being asked to answer the question, what do you do if a UK government refuses point blank to accept democracy? Now that is just an absurd position for anybody to be put into. And the fact that I can't come up with the neat soundbite answer to that is not actually some reason to criticise me. It's a reflection of how outrageous the situation is.
Merely asking the questions. Let me come on to the timing of this, because you've been very clear all the way through that you wanted to get rid of the pandemic as an issue and deal with that first. Now, when do you think that's going to happen? I'm not going to try and give you a simplistic answer to that. We are in a pandemic, things are looking pretty good. We are seeing case numbers continue to fall, vaccination is going well. I said in the manifesto, if COVID conditions allowed, in the first half of the parliamentary term, but the Parliament will have to judge whether that is the case. Without being simplistic or glib, I hope, the outgoing head of the Vaccine Task Force, Clive Dick, says that he believes that by some time in August, quotes, we will have no circulating virus in the UK. And in terms of the economic recovery, the Bank of England is saying that GDP is expected to recover strongly to pre-COVID levels over the remainder of this year. Now, if they're both, roughly speaking, right, then by early next year, by the spring of next year, the pandemic issue will be over, be off your desk. Well, is that the point at which you bring independence legislation?
That would certainly work for that time scale of within the first half of this parliamentary term. But I will judge that. I very much, not just for reasons of an independence referendum, but for many more reasons, I desperately hope those predictions are correct, but we have to judge that as we go through this year. We've still got significant challenges ahead. There are still many countries.
But the legislation could land in the Scottish Parliament early next year.
I wouldn't rule that out, but equally I'm not
Okay.
sitting here right now
All
and
right.
saying that that is the timescale. The people of Scotland re-elected me as First Minister with the first task of continuing to steer us through this pandemic, getting us into recovery. Then, of course, there is a question about what kind of recovery do we want, what kind of country are we rebuilding to, and that brings into sharp focus where do decisions lie. I'm not sure the kind of recovery that Boris Johnson envisages is one that a majority of people in Scotland would support.
Well, let's look at the kind of country an independent Scotland might be. For how long would you be using the pound?
For as long as that was economically in our interests to do that, and we would then move over time to a Scottish currency. But again, these are all the things, you and I had an exchange on this just before the election. These are all things that in a white paper, as we did in 2014, we will lay out fully for the Scottish people. We will, and I'm determined about this point, that we will also lay out frankly the challenges that an independent Scotland would face, the challenges that would come with transition to independence. I'm not saying it would be challenge free, but it is absolutely the right thing for Scotland because it puts control over our future and the kind of country we become into our own hands.
But not control over your currency or over monetary policy, possibly for years to come. Your own Growth Commission says that Scotland should retain the pound sterling for, and I quote, a possibly extended transition period. I don't know if that's weeks, months, years or decades.
Well, I think that is likely to be a period of years. But it is right that we have and that we set out, and the Growth Commission did this candidly. It set out the work that would require to be done. It set out the conditions and the tests that would require
I'm sorry to interrupt, but for years ahead, an independent Scotland would accept swallow monetary policy dictated by a Bank of England who would have absolutely no interest in what happened in the Scottish economy because it'd be outside its remit. If there was another pandemic and they were slashing interest rates or another crisis and they were slashing interest rates, they would not be thinking about Scotland in any sense. So this allegedly independent Scotland would be dependent on the Bank of England for years for its monetary policy.
If the economic conditions allowed, we would move quicker to that. But Andrew, these are all decisions that people will weigh up in an independence referendum and take. What you've described right now is
talking about, aren't they?
Of course, they're worth talking about. You know, I'm often accused of wanting to talk about nothing but independence. It's not true, but I have absolutely the appetite to talk about these things. But it is right and proper that, as happened in 2014, the case for independence and all of the different issues that have to be confronted would be set out openly and clearly to people. But some of what is described, you'd have no control over this, that, or the other. That's how life feels for people in Scotland right now. We've just been taken out of the
Bank
European
of England
Union.
has to think about the Scottish economy right now.
Look,
after independence, it wouldn't. If there was another
and in a transition period, we would be doing the work to set up our own central bank and the infrastructure that goes with that. You're coming on to quantitative easing. You know, there was more quantitative easing, I think, by the UK government than any other government in the financial crash, but actually the UK government did less well economically. What we want to do in Scotland is emulate some of the successes of small independent countries that avert these kind of banking crises in the future. But these are all, we've just been taken out of the European Union, we've just been taken out of the single market. You don't have to go far in Scotland right now to find companies that are paying a very heavy price for that, including fishing industry companies that were promised the earth and not delivered. So these are all big issues, these are all important issues, and these are issues that have to be laid out to people in Scotland fully and comprehensively so that an informed judgment can be made.
Because of the fiscal transfer, as it's called, Scotland's finances are effectively subsidised by English taxpayers at the moment. That would cease with independence. Is that a price worth paying?
Well, I don't accept that characterisation. Scotland pays its taxes in the same way as people in England pay their taxes. What you call the fiscal transfer, funded largely by borrowing by the UK government because the Scottish government doesn't have powers to borrow. But the other point is...
Sorry, I'm sorry to interrupt, but you say you're going to accept it. Scotland receives £1,671 or 17% more per person than the UK average, and at the same time its tax revenues are £308 lower per person. So that means a fiscal transfer that would stop with independence. I ask again, is that a price worth paying?
Look, if you're pointing to the position that Scotland has right now, the fiscal position of Scotland right now, that is a feature of Westminster government decisions around macroeconomic policy and fiscal decisions. It's not a reflection of independence. So are you, if anybody is
It's a net
saying,
move of money, isn't it?
well, but why should a country like Scotland, with all of the attributes and assets and skills and natural and people resources that Scotland has, be in a position of requiring to be, to use the pejorative language, subsidised? So if that's the position Scotland is in right now, that would suggest that there is something about how we are governed that is not working properly. It's not an argument for staying the same, it's an argument for change. Because when we look around Europe and the world right now, what we see is the world is littered with independent countries of a similar size to Scotland, some smaller than Scotland, that are amongst the most prosperous,
At least in
the
this limited
happiest,
regard, you accept that Scotland will be a bit poorer. At least in
no,
that limited regard for that transfer, which is a factual transfer.
I don't accept that Scotland, as an independent country, will be poorer. I do accept that we will have to manage our finances like any other independent country, but the ability to manage that in a way that sits with our values, that
Okay, but in
makes
this
sure
limited regard, as it were, you accept the numbers.
we would, well, if you're quoting
These are real
Gers, these are
numbers.
government figures. I'm not denying the validity of them. They're based on a range of assumptions that around the margins you could argue around, but we could take our own spending decisions. You know, in there is the money that is spent on, you know, things like the House of Lords, Trident, all things that I don't think an independent Scotland would choose to spend money on. So these are, Scotland is a wealthy, prosperous, skilled, talented country. Why on earth could we not be a prosperous, independent country?
The Prime Minister has invited you to a summit. Are you going to go?
Of course. Look, I will work with the Prime Minister and anybody in the interest of COVID recovery. Of course I will. I've done it all through the last year. But I also want to be in a position where our decisions around the COVID recovery long term are not dependent on decisions that Boris Johnson takes, because I guess that at some point we will find that that takes Scotland in a direction we don't want to go in. But I will cooperate with Boris Johnson and whoever in the interest of getting the country through COVID and into recovery.
We've heard that people in England, south of the border, are going to be able to hug again from the 17th of May and go to each other's houses. When is that going to happen in Scotland?
Look, I'm not going to give you that date right now, but I am leaving you to wind my way back to Butte House, and I'll be, over the course of today and tomorrow, meeting with clinical advisors. We have a COVID review on Tuesday, where we'll set out the final decisions for the next easing of restrictions scheduled for the 17th of May, and these are exactly the decisions that I'm anxious, as soon as you let me go, Andrew, to get back to and start to take.
One last question before I do. You've had a very, very long and up and down relationship with Alex Salmond. He's effectively, at the moment, it seems, more or less out of politics now. He was very pleased by some of the things that you said about him towards the end of the campaign. Is there any chance of a personal rapprochement?
Look, I don't think Alex Salmond and I are going to go back to the way things were, but you know, there is nothing about what has happened around Alex Salmond in the last few years that gives me any pleasure whatsoever. It is a source of quite deep sadness to me, and that's personal. Obviously, the politics are separate.
Well, let's move from one last non-personal question. Is Nicola Sturgeon going to be the First Minister who is still there to deliver independence?
I hope so. I've just won a landslide election and another term, 5-year term as First Minister. I've got the energy, the appetite to get on with the job. Firstly, to get us through COVID, that is my priority. And then I hope to lead Scotland to independence. But you know what? The future of Scotland, and I hope the independent future of Scotland, is much bigger than any one individual politician.
Nicola Sturgeon, thanks very much indeed for coming in to talk to us today. Much appreciated. That's all from me. Thanks to all my guests and, of course, to you for watching.